Welcome back, world history students. I'm just going to remind you where we were last week. We had just started talking about Italy and the birthplace of the Renaissance. We had talked about it starting in Italy, it lasting about 300 years. And here's some visual reminders of some of the things that we talked about. While you're watching this lesson, if you'll be logged into Socrative, you will have 10 questions that coincide with our lesson today. And here's your first question. So in the last class, we reviewed some of the causes of the Renaissance, and they included the Crusades, as well as the plague. And we discussed how the Crusades and the plague disrupted the way that the Middle Ages was working. It caused people to leave the countryside and move back toward the cities. So during the Renaissance time period, cities grew, especially early on, city-states in Italy. Here's the boot of Italy. City-states in the northern part of Italy, like Florence, grew substantially. We also talked about the Medici family and how, because people were seeking to trade after the Crusades, that the banking industry, the ability to move money, became important, and the Medici family grew more important than the kings and queens and some of the popes. And in fact, the Medici family would have 4 popes in their family.
Meanwhile, people in Florence and other Italian cities were developing new ways of looking at life as they rediscovered the intellectual and artistic achievements of ancient Greece and Rome. These new ideas and their spread out of Italy began a period that historians call the Renaissance. The invention of the printing press in the mid-15th century made it easier for these new ideas to spread. During the 15th century, European navigators began searching for a sea route to the riches of the East Indies. After many voyages of exploration, Portuguese navigators rounded the tip of Africa and reached India in 1498. Meanwhile, in 1492, Christopher Columbus convinced Spanish authorities that he could reach the Indies by sailing west across the Atlantic. Instead, he discovered the uncharted Americas and claimed the land for Spain. Soon the English, French, and Dutch were undertaking their own voyages of exploration and laying claim to newly discovered lands. As knowledge of the world increased, so did competition between various European states for control of global resources. New ideas also led some Europeans to question long-established beliefs. In the early 16th century, Martin Luther and other religious leaders advocated reforms in Roman Catholic practices. This call to reform led to the breaking up of Western Christendom into Catholic and Protestant branches. Many kings and princes used the reform movement as a justification for escaping the centralized religious authority represented by the Pope in Rome. Wars over religion broke out between Catholics and Protestants and lasted off and on through most of the 16th and 17th centuries. During an 18th century period known as the Age of Reason, European intellectuals promoted cosmopolitan and humanistic values. Toward the end of this century, in 1789, the French Revolution began with a cry from the people for liberty, equality, and fraternity. Meanwhile, people in Florence
The French revolutions are next unit, so I'm going to stop that video right there. But hopefully you were seeing some of the other things that were happening during this time period that we're not talking about right at the moment, like exploration and war. Today we're going to talk about a couple of important concepts like humanism and secular. And we're also going to talk about some artistic techniques that take the Renaissance art to a new level. As scholars studied Greek and Roman manuscripts, they became more and more influenced by those classical ideas. And these ideas helped them to develop a new outlook on life, and that gets reflected in art. The study of classical texts led to humanism. Humanism is an intellectual movement that focuses on human potential and individual achievement. Instead of trying to make classical texts agree with Christian teaching, as medieval scholars had in many cases, humanists studied them to understand ancient Greek values. Humanists influenced artists and architects to carry on classical traditions. Also, humanists popularized the study of subjects common to classical education, like history and literature and philosophy. To this day, these subjects are called the humanities, and it's very likely that in most college settings, you're required to take a group of courses around the humanities because they think that it helps you to develop into a well-rounded person. I chose to remind you of this Jean Van Eyck piece, The Wedding Portrait, because it's a great example of humanism in that individually, they're seeking to draw attention to the individual here as opposed to the church. This guy is a banker. He's achieved a lot in his lifetime. And he's seeking a portrait of himself, celebrating this moment between he and his wife, his new wife. In the Middle Ages, some people had demonstrated their piety, which means their religiousness, by wearing rough clothing and eating really plain foods. The whole idea was that if you were suffering in this lifetime, you were being reminded of Christ's suffering. However, humanists said that it's okay to enjoy life without offending God. In the Renaissance time period, in Italy in particular, the wealthy enjoyed a lot of luxurious things, like good food, fine wine. In some cases, they wore really luxurious clothing. Most people actually remained pretty devout Catholics. However, the basic spirits of the Renaissance society was secular, meaning it was more open-minded and worldly. Worldly rather than spiritual, and concerned with the here and now. So the way that you were feeling in this life right at the moment, not living for heaven in the future, but instead living life here while you're on earth. Even church leaders became more worldly. Some lived in beautiful mansions, some threw lavish banquets, and some wore expensive clothes. In fact, some popes even had girlfriends and mistresses. Even though, if you guys know much about the Catholic Church, the Pope and the clergy are supposed to remain celibate for their life. This up here is an example of a hair shirt. And what it is, it's a shirt that has rough hairs inside, and people would strap it on themselves during the Middle Ages as a reminder of suffering. I don't know if you guys have ever worn something that had rough inside and it made you itch a lot. That's what these were designed to do. In some cases, people took their suffering to another level and wore things like this around their thigh or their upper arm. This has little barbs And it's kind of like a spiked dog collar, but worn in reverse so that the spikes are actually into your flesh. And they would cinch it up really tight. And every time you moved, that tight, cinched, like barbed, would kind of cut into you. And it was a reminder of suffering. So people were moving away from wearing things like this in the Middle Ages to wearing things that are beautiful and comfortable and making them happy in the here and now. Another great example of humanism is The Vitruvian Man by Leonardo da Vinci, where he's literally exploring the human body, which is also a great kind of throwback to Greece and Rome, where they studied carefully the human body. In The Vitruvian Man, Leonardo da Vinci is playing around with proportions, like trying to figure out, like, if you were going to create in art the leg of a person, what is that in comparison to the arm, so that you get the lengths in the body proportionally correct to make it look more realistic. Church leaders during the Renaissance beautified Rome and other cities by spending huge amounts of money on art. They became patrons of the art. You become a patron of the art by financially supporting artists, and Renaissance merchants and wealthy families, as you guys already know, the Medicis and the Borgias and the Sforza family, they were all patrons of the arts. By having their portraits painted or by donating art to the city or to public squares, the wealthy demonstrated their own importance. In fact, the Medici family eventually opened up their own private library to the public to kind of display a status symbol to the rest of the world. Another form of humanism, celebrating human achievement, is the movement during the Renaissance to paint realistic portraits of just regular people. I mean, prominent citizens, yes, because they would have had enough money to have the portrait done. But these are not cardinals, these are not popes, these are not kings and queens, these are people. And so this movement toward portraits representing a more diverse group of people is part of humanism being represented by Renaissance art. So you can see that here. Renaissance writers introduced the idea that all educated people were expected to create art. In fact, the ideal individual strove to master almost every area of study. A man who excelled in many fields was praised as a universal man, and later ages called those people Renaissance men. And in fact, we're going to talk about Leonardo da Vinci being a great example. Leonardo da Vinci, who created The Last Supper, being a great example of a Renaissance man. Supported by patrons like Isabel d'Este, dozens of artists worked in northern Italy to create these new pieces of art. And there are 3 different types of artistic techniques that we're going to talk about today that are specific to the Renaissance. And the first is perspective. So in this piece down here, you can see perspective used, and in a slide to follow, you'll see a kind of a breakdown of this. But perspective utilizes something called a vanishing point and a horizon line. And then lines throughout in the painting utilize that to create kind of like a zoomed in effect or a zoom out effect. It also gives the artist kind of a guide to how large or small something ought to be to give the appearance or the illusion of depth. Another technique is something called chiaroscuro. Chiaroscuro is the use of light, and in this painting here, if you look at it carefully, like, where is the light coming from? Hopefully you're seeing that the light is coming from, it looks like there's a little flame here, and that he might be holding a candle, and the light is on the other side of the paper. And chiaroscuro is playing around with making sure that people know, like, where the light is coming from and how does that appear in a painting when the light is coming from a particular source. And then finally, sfumato is a blending technique. This painting over here is a representative of sfumato. Sfumato means smoky in Italian, and it's a blending technique of blending light and dark together to create the illusion of a line that doesn't actually exist instead of a hard line that would look more primitive. So let's take a look at some of those. So these are some classic paintings that make use of perspective. So Renaissance artists use perspective to show kind of three dimensions on a flat surface. Perspective creates the appearance of three dimensions. Classical artists used perspective, but medieval artists abandoned the technique in the 1400s, and so they didn't really utilize this. It's based on an optical illusion that there are parallel lines that so that there's a horizon line and a vanishing point, and then from that there are lines that stretch away from the viewer and they seem to kind of draw together until they meet on a spot called a vanishing point. The use of perspective was a feature of most Western paintings for the next 450 years. You can see here, probably the vanishing point. Here are the lines. So the vanishing point is maybe around here. Here's the horizon line. And then from that, you see these lines. You can see them on the tiles, right? Coming out here, you can kind of see the lines. Okay. And it gives a guide to how small and how large something ought to be, how large in the foreground and how small in the background. Okay, another classical painting technique is sfumato. Leonardo da Vinci supposedly was the one who kind of coined the use of sfumato during the Renaissance, and then it, like we've said before, then it becomes the norm. But Mona Lisa's eyes are supposed to be one of the best examples of early sfumato. If you see here, her eye doesn't have like a hard line drawn like that eyeball, but a dark and a light that's all blended together. It gives a softer, more vague illusion of a line, but looks more realistic. So that's sfumato. It means smoky in Italian. Okay, the next technique is chiaroscuro, and chiaroscuro is a little bit harder to describe, but it's the use of it's light source and what a light source looks like when it hits something or someone, and how to represent that in a painting. So here's kind of a basic, just using a sphere. So what they say is that what they explore and find is that a light source, when it hits something, is going to have a little bit of a highlight and be brightest where the light is directly hitting the subject. And then as the light kind of expands out, it gets gradually a little bit dimmer and fades. And then there's this shadowing effect. But something interesting too that you wouldn't normally think about is that there's a little tiny bit of reflected light at the end of the shadowing of the object. Little bit of reflected light as it's bouncing back off of whatever's behind it. And then there's a shadow cast. And so this highlight and the way that the light fades and then this reflected light is really important if you want to get the light source and the realism in the portrait. So here are a couple of examples of chiaroscuro. So here you can tell that the light source is somewhere in front of her, right? That's hitting her. And then there's shadows and then a little bit of reflected light around her jawline that makes it kind of highlight there. Okay. Here, chiaroscuro is played around. There's the light sources here in the middle. There's the tip of the candle right here, and you can see how they're lit up from the middle of the painting. This piece is called The Matchmaker. and how they fade into shadow, but there's a little bit of like reflected light here that gives you the outline of the hair. You can see a tiny bit of reflected, like lightened piece right here on the edge, which lets you know where like his outfit ends, right? And this, the Van Eyck piece, is supposed to be a classic example of chiaroscuro, which is why I keep using it. It demonstrates all kinds of things, but that light source coming in through the window and this fade from highlight to shadow cast and reflection is kind of classic chiaroscuro. Okay, last piece. Leonardo da Vinci is an interesting guy because, like I was telling you a little bit about before, something important to the Renaissance was this idea that people could do a lot of things well. Leonardo da Vinci is the kind of quintessential, which means the best example, many say, of something called a Renaissance man, because he was not just a painter, not just a sculptor, he was good at so many things. And so he's a great example of a Renaissance man. And today, I think we still in our society celebrate people like jacks of all trades, people that can do a lot of different things.
The Mona Lisa, The Last Supper, The Vitruvian Man, just a few of the iconic works that made Leonardo da Vinci one of the most famous artists in history. But da Vinci was also a scientist, architect, sculptor, musician, engineer, and inventor who once said, "The knowledge of all things is possible." His boundless curiosity and achievements are the reasons da Vinci is still recognized as the ideal Renaissance man. Leonardo da Vinci was born an illegitimate child in the province of Vinci, Italy, on April 15, 1452. At 15, he apprenticed under the famous painter Verrocchio in Florence. There, he refined his skills and adapted his trademark sfumato, or smoky technique, which avoids harsh outlines. This technique gives da Vinci's paintings a unique depth. Eventually, he surpassed Verrocchio himself, who allegedly vowed never to pick up a paintbrush again after teaching the young Leonardo. In 1482, da Vinci became a professional painter in Milan. He completed The Virgin of the Rocks and The Last Supper shortly after his arrival. For The Last Supper, da Vinci used a new Renaissance technique called perspective that brought new realism to paintings by making distant objects smaller than those closest to the viewer. Da Vinci draws the viewer's eye to the space above Jesus, which gives it the illusion of great space and depth. During his 17 years in Milan, da Vinci finished only 6 paintings. Instead, he focused on various scientific studies. Da Vinci said, "Learning never exhausts the mind." He kept track of his ideas with meticulous illustrations and entries in a series of notebooks. These notebooks reveal da Vinci's true genius. Da Vinci drew plans for everything from churches and fortresses to water systems and bridges. For the Duke of Milan, he designed advanced weapons, including a tank and machine gun. Da Vinci's fascination with flight produced sketches for flying machines centuries before the first airplane was built. Da Vinci's interest in human anatomy was expressed in the Vitruvian Man, a drawing that explains the proportions of the human body. His study of anatomy brought a gripping realism to his paintings, especially the Mona Lisa, or La Gioconda, the Laughing One, which he finished around 1507. Fellow Renaissance painter Giorgio Vasari said that the Mona Lisa's smile was so pleasing that it seemed divine rather than human, and those who saw it were amazed to find that it was as alive as the original. Da Vinci's fame never subsided, even after his death in 1519. Crowds still wait in line to see the Mona Lisa at the Louvre Museum in France. Just as writers, scientists, and historians continue to study his works and marvel at his genius. Da Vinci's advice for the development of a complete mind was study the science of art. Study the art of science. Develop your senses, especially learn how to see. Realize that everything connects to everything else. He did not see a divide between art and science and was perhaps one of the most diversely talented people who ever lived. It is for this reason that many call Leonardo da Vinci the first Renaissance man.